And we are two people here. My name is Lutz Reuswig. I'm from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. And this is Professor Mohammed Al-Rai. And the third person should be here. This is Professor Schäfer, but I learned that his plane is arriving late. So there are the two of us. We are supposed to fill the gap between the coffee break and the lunch break. And we will do our best, I think. First of all, let me please introduce our panel speaker today before I start with some introductory remarks. Professor Rai gave me some notes, which was really important things for him, and you have the biography in your documents. But I should say that he's a professor at the University of Alexandria with a background in remote sensing, GIS, and climate change, which is one of the challenges we are going to discuss about when we meet the needs for resilience. He's also the director of Climate Change and Risk Reduction Center at the University of Alexandria. Risk reduction is a big word and a great need in these days, I think. And he is also chairman of NGO Friends of Environment in Alexandria, so that he is also engaged practically in what he is talking about. And I'm really honored to sit next to a Nobel Prize winner to some degree, because as you know, in 2007, IPCC won, together with Al Gore, the Peace Nobel Prize. And IPCC won it as a body of excellence and of engagement. And as Professor Al-Rai was working with IPCC representing Egypt, especially in Working Group 2, which is on impacts and vulnerability, he is also part of this Nobel Prize award. So very nice to have you at my side. Thank you. Before I give the word to him, I would like to start, and that's my task, that's why I'm here, to set a little bit the scene of what we're talking about, right? And as you see, it will be a little bit more on climate change than on other issues, but you will see very soon, I think, that we cannot cope with climate change impacts unless we discuss other aspects of sustainability and non-sustainability, and how to make systems more resilient. So perceive it as you like, as a case study in resilience in more general. Now I shift my function and give you the introduction a little bit. Now, climate change and the MENA region and Europe and the differences between all of this. First of all, climate change. We will learn more about this here. I'm a sociologist, I'm not a climate person, I'm not a climate scientist, but in the Climate Institute as a sociologist. Nevertheless, I think the physical changes are really interesting, and how to communicate them is also interesting. And colleagues from France did a great job in illustrating what climate change might mean to us, to all of us, to some degree. What they did here, for example, is they took some scenarios. We will have to talk a lot about scenarios, because climate change is mainly in the future. And what kind of future we have is decisive about what the impacts will be. Now, this is a high-level, high-emission scenario. So a lot of people, a lot of industrial activity, a lot of economic activity, a lot of emissions, right? And if this will happen in 2100, we will have a different climate from today. And what the colleagues did, they took a map, a meteorological map of Europe of these days, and then they asked themselves, what will be the climate measured in temperature of some cities in Europe, and they were mainly interested in Europe as Europeans. What will be the main changes, what will be the climate of some cities in Europe in the year 2000? And then they mapped those future climate cities to today's climate map of Europe, in order to see right now where those cities will be located, if you like, in the future, so that you can have a trip as a travel or as a holiday trip to some place and see my city in the future will look like this city today. And what we see is that some cities move quite a lot in the year 2100. For example, Berlin, Brussels and London, they are located in the west of Spain. Oslo has moved to the center of Europe with its future climate. And some cities even have changed the Mediterranean seaside. So cities like Barcelona, Athens, they move from the northern shore of the Mediterranean to the southern shore. They will have a climate that you experience in the MENA region already today. And these are major shifts, if you like. And if you walk around these cities today and you see how the urban fabric is, what the architecture looks like, how this urban life is organized, you will see what adaptation needs and what pressure for adaptation in European cities will have to come. This is no information for people in the MENA region, this is a basic information for people in Europe. But European cities will find themselves climatically in a situation that MENA regions have already today. Now, cities and climate change, if you like, it's a global issue. Climate change is something global, we all know this, but in reality, what is global at the end? I mean, what's really globalization? What is really a global thing? Sometimes people use globalization or global as meaning something. Global is always somewhere else, right? I'm here, but the global thing must be somewhere else. But this is wrong, in fact. Globalization is a very local thing as well, so we should talk about globalization, if you like. So, for example, with emission, it's the same thing. There are no global CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions. There are only local emissions. And by some chemical treatments, some chemical properties of molecules, these local emissions have global effects, but they remain local emissions, if you like. So there is a local contribution to a global problem all the time. And if you take it from a remote sensing perspective, which is the perspective of Professor Harel later, cities make up only about 3% of the firm Earth in spatial terms, but they are home to more than 50% of the global population, more than 70% of global GDP, which is also, I think, something that many people are looking at, and 60 to 80% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Depends on what accounting scheme you choose. Is it a consumption-based assessment or a production-based assessment that makes up the difference? Now, the international climate policy, all those great places of the UNFCCC process, they are processes with nation states. Right? Nation states are the big actors. And the national representatives, they deal with 180 others and NGOs and so forth. It's a national policy thing. But still, cities are responsible to a great degree, but they are not participating in this international process. You might say cities are much smaller than the nations. No, this is not correct. There are many small nations on this planet and many poor people. And there are many, many big cities. Some of them are rich, but then that's not a necessary precondition. But many urban emissions are much bigger than emissions of small states. And this only even holds for Europe. If you take London, for example, and Greece, especially in these days, London's emissions are much higher than those of whole Greece. But still, Greece is participating in international negotiations, and not the Lord Mayor of London. Although the Lord Mayor of London, or the city as a whole, controls more emissions than Greece. And in fact, for example, the congestion charge in London, which was designed for other reasons than climate change, has contributed much more to reduce CO2 emissions than what Greece has done. Maybe except for the crisis. Tragic to say. Per capita emissions in cities differ a lot, as I mentioned, depending on the poverty rates and so forth. There is no MENA city here unfortunately. I have only European, American, and Asian cities there, because we are working in Asia, in India especially. What you see is that we have a huge difference of per capita footprints, carbon footprints of urban inhabitants. And you must, and you could, in a first guess, say, well, this is a problem of wealth. The richer the people, the more emissions they have. This would be a first approach to explain those differences. Fortunately, I have to say, this is not totally correct. It's not totally wrong, but it's not precise enough. And especially if you talk about urbanism, it is very important to look in more detail in this. This is another metric. Forget about the metric. This is environmental footprint. Wackernagel and others, they have chosen another currency, if you like. It's not CO2, it's the environmental footprint, it's space. They have also transformed CO2 into space. We do not debate about this methodological thing here. There are a lot of problems with that. But if I had a map of CO2, it would be a similar result as you have seen in the former chart. Now this is the footprint of urban inhabitants. As I mentioned, per capita. It's not per city. This would not make sense if we compare different cities, right? It's per capita. And what we see here is that, now it's the great minute for a pointer. Yes, it works, thank you. Is that this is Houston, I don't know if you can read that. This is New York, this is Toronto, this is Shanghai, London, Tokyo, Beijing, and this is Santiago de Chile, right? And there are different colors, meaning different needs of urban inhabitants that are responsible for those footprints. And the first interesting information is I find that this is food. So the footprint, the space needed to produce food in all those cities per capita is comparably the same. It's not exactly the same, but it's almost the same. So this basic need of providing food, although the overall footprint is very different, is almost the same. But look now at housing and mobility, the light green and the yellow thing. Housing and mobility needs. This is a huge difference between the cities. This is Houston. No. This is Houston. CO2 tons per capita. It's about 15. And this is Houston as well, environmental space. Now the famous phrase, Houston, we have a problem, has its base here and not in space. Now, housing and mobility, they account for a huge difference. And then there comes something like this is, for example, services, goods. There are also differences in the goods sector, right? What stuff people have, of course, this is a difference. But I would like to focus on housing and mobility here, because this is very important for urbanism, for urban form and so forth, right? Now look, there are huge differences in the overall footprint. And if we now attach the per capita GDP of those cities here, and if we would have the situation that we would find rich people here and poor people here, this would be bad news, right? Really bad news. Imagine, I mean, you don't find in the list of those cities, I think you don't find your most hated city. Yeah? Most people have a city, or some cities they do not like, whether they've been there or not. I don't want you to reveal which city that is. I don't know, you might have an impression, but you will have a city that you do not like, because you think it's too ugly, it's too noisy, it's too loud, people are too poor, it's too criminal, what have you. And if this city that you do not like would occur here, down here, then this would be a graph that would be, in communication and political terms, a disaster. Because the message of this graph would be, if you want to reduce your environmental footprint, you have to become poor, ugly, everything you don't like. And this would be a hard choice and hard to communicate. Because in the first lecture we have learned how hard it is to deal with the elements of traditionality and modernity. People want to be modern, right? And it's sometimes very different difficult to connect and reconnect traditional forms of architecture with modernity, although they are more modern even in a more future climate. So modernity and shiny and everything, this is something very important. And if the message would be, reduce your footprint but be less modern, then I think climate policy wouldn't have any chance. But this is fortunately not the case. Maybe Santiago, but Beijing, Tokyo, for example. Compare the footprint of Tokyo to the footprint of Houston, or the footprint of London with the footprint of Houston. I doubt whether Houstonites, people of Houston per capita, have a higher GDP than those of Tokyo or London. I think it's the other way around. People in Tokyo are richer than people in Houston, Texas, I think. But still, the per capita footprint of Houston is much higher. Why? Because of the urban form and the urban life. Because of the way the city is built, and the city is run, and the city is organized. If you have suburbia and car transportation attached to it, your footprint will go up. But if you have a much denser city, you can keep your per capita GDP, but reduce your footprint substantially. So this is I think this is a clear challenge for architects and urban planners, and others, of course. But to make the urban form in a way that the footprint is reduced, although your wealth could be the same or even higher. And this is, I think, the encouraging message of this talk. Now we were invited in this session to talk about MENA and the particularities of MENA to other regions. Unfortunately, I'm not a specialist with the MENA region, with Egypt or something like that. I have to apologize. We work a little bit in India, and this is why Hyderabad shows up here. We have done the climate protection thing for Potsdam, the strategy for Potsdam, and we've looked a little bit in Masdar City, what happened in Masdar City in the United Arab Emirates. And you see, we have a lot of very huge differences. And the interesting thing with the MENA region is that it does not follow the clear-cut pattern of development versus developed world. We have a highly uneven development pattern, which gives you some challenges but also some opportunities. And I don't go into this because we don't have time for that, but comparing cities I think is very important. Structural features of city systems is very important. Now, before I hand over, we were invited to think about resilience as something that might help, especially if we look at the MENA region. And as I said, climate change, although I was talking about it 10 minutes now, is something which is for the most of the people, whether the business sector or poor people or the middle class, it is something which is not really of interest in their daily lives if we observe them and not ask them, do you think climate change is important? And we will say, yeah, somehow, yes. But if we look at it in real life, it's not the case. And in fact, it's not even the case in countries like Germany if we are really knocked hard. Now, climate change, as we will learn right next to my presentation, is something that is a real concern, whether people believe it or not. There will be things to discuss: heat load, water quantity and quality, sea level rise, weather extremes, climate refugees, food provisioning, and so forth. And I think this region will be affected by all of these processes really hard. And believe it or not, that's what the models say. And we'll learn much more about it later. But the region is characterized with very uneven economic and social development, as I mentioned, right? The contrasts are huge if you travel to places like Cairo, or even in the Arab Peninsula and so forth. As a European, I mean, you find some extremely rich things, and then you find a lot of poverty and underdevelopment. It's a contrasting picture. It's really a very contrasting universe, and this is a challenge for us. I think there is some lack of regional cooperation as well. Now, coming from the European Union these days, it's not easy to sell the idea of a European Union or something like that, of a regional cooperation. There are some problems the Union is facing. Nevertheless, it manages the crisis up to now. And I think the historical experience of the community has shown that regional cooperation, even if it starts at some points, and the European Union started small, it was iron and steel, and it was very pragmatic. It has a very pragmatic starting point, and at the end of the day, it ended up as, and now we're not at the end of the day, maybe there will be a breakup of it, or maybe there will be a political union or something like that. Nevertheless, the years it has existed has shown that it has really fostered regional cooperation and really contributed to reduce regional disparities to a large degree. A lot of money of the European Union goes into balancing regional imbalances, if you like. There's a lot of bureaucratic effort behind that, but if you go through European regions and, for example, rather new parts of the community like Poland and so forth, which has a totally different past of history, you find that these imbalances are much smaller than in the MENA region. So there would be some idea of cooperation, of course. A lack of investment in education. Many studies say this is a much more severe problem than what you do with climate. And in fact, in improving your resilience, the resilience of the region, the investment in education at all levels should be much higher, especially with respect to women, I think. And this is a problem that for the future is a very, very important thing. Population growth, I don't have to mention that. Heterogeneous political development, we have all kinds of regimes, as you know. Many regional conflicts are in the MENA region, in the wider sense, that have international dimensions. I don't have to go into details. Many parts are blessed with oil and gas. It's a very mixed blessing, as you know, and the low oil price is somehow preventing, for example, the transportation sector, something shifts. We have corruption, we have it everywhere on the planet, but also here. And we do have weak forms of urban autonomy and governance to some degree, local governance, I mean. Now, why should resilience help us here? I think the concept is good. It's around for a couple of years, yes, but it was a good choice to talk about it on this symposium. It's holistic, it's integrative, and it's transdisciplinary. Okay. It combines coping strategies and learning with socio-ecological structures and processes. So it has a clear connection. It's not an academic study concept, it has a clear connection to governance and to management, at least. Professor Schäfer would have been a good person to discuss what's the difference between management and governance and so forth. But I think there is a clear management perspective. This is why the concept has been invented in the first place. But if you look at definitions of resilience, it's always something like a system is able to cope with external stress or not, the degrees of resilience. But if we talk about an urban system, what is an urban system, by the way, and about an urbanized world, what is an external shock? I mean, climate change to some degree is an external shock, but as mentioned, that cities are responsible for a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. So, to some degree, it's not external. And a lot of problems and stress are created within the urban system itself. So, we have to rethink or sharpen resilience so that it can also deal with disturbances that are created within the urban system, because it's the most important thing for the urban system. There are some external things as well, but I think it's a mixed picture. And then we cannot praise or optimize the stability of a system before we have met some basic goals of sustainable development. Stability, shock-proof, resilience, and so forth. These are formal terms, if you like, and we have to fill them with some more content. So all people that say resilience is much better than sustainable development, I would say we have to reach sustainable development or make some progress towards it, and then we can stabilize the system. Stabilization without looking at some parameter of sustainability doesn't make any sense. And I think this is what the recent political developments in the region, and especially in Cairo, has taught us, as an external observer, I might say, that
if you look at it from some distance, you can say that destabilization and regime change are sometimes more important than stability. But now, the question is, how can the new democratic momentum be stabilized and used for a sustainable progress? This is, I think, very important. And the final word with conceptual things, or how to approach, I have the impression that this morning is very, very valuable from a methodological point of view, a very valuable contribution, because it was a demonstration of how top-down and bottom-up processes in research and in doing something have to be combined. Because city, the urban system, this always looks something like a very distant thing. But as a sociologist, my perspective would always be to look at how is the urban system created? And it's more like the urban system is something, it's a byproduct of people living their lives, of small business holders, of people, women meeting the needs of their families, of business people, of all kinds of interactions. And the city system is a byproduct. Sometimes it's a deliberate, intentional product, but most of the time it's an unintentional process, a micrological thing. And in order to find institutions and rules to make them more sustainable and then resilient, is not only about this top-down thing about planning, which is important, and there are all kinds of deficits, but we also should look at how do people live their lives, study that, in order to find what would make a change, how could they become more resilient, what would resilience mean in their daily lives. And then conceptual things like capability approach of Zen or something would be something to connect the idea of resilience to the idea of how people become more sustainable and more resistant to shock and more solidarity, if you like, as well. So, these are my introductory remarks. I thank you for your attention and would now hand over to our panel speaker, Professor Lai, and invite him to come forward. And I hope that I can manage this to get this away. Start.